On an autumn afternoon in the heart of Connecticut's wealthiest suburb, a young maid named Bridget Fay steps into a mansion sealed by fear rather than grief. Inside lives Spencer Steve, a millionaire CEO who runs his home like a boardroom, and Elizabeth, his 10-year-old blind daughter, silent and withdrawn since losing her sight 2 years ago. This afternoon, Bridget will try something no certified therapist has attempted, teaching a blind child to see through touch, texture, and the forgotten language of color. What Elizabeth does next will crack open a father's carefully controlled world and expose a truth buried in paint and memory. Stay with us to the end to discover how art, intuition, and one woman's courage transform blindness into vision and silence into revelation. And tell us, do you believe some people can see more without their eyes than others do with them? Bridget Fay knelt on the polished hardwood floor of the Steve Mansion's living room, her knees pressed against the cool surface as she arranged textured paint palettes across a low table Elizabeth could reach. The easel stood between them like a quiet invitation, canvas blank and waiting. She hadn't done this in years, not since the experimental therapy center, not since the director told her she was too reckless, too willing to break protocol for the sake of connection. But the paints were already open now, thick ridges of crimson that felt rough under fingertips, smooth, cool blues that slid like silk, warm yellows with a sandy grit that suggested sunlight and heat. These weren't just colors, they were sensations, memories, invitations to a world Elizabeth had been told she'd lost forever. Bridget had brought them today on instinct, not because it was part of her job description. She was hired to fold laundry and dust shelves, not to play therapist. But something in Elizabeth's behavior over the past few weeks had sparked a quiet certainty in Bridget's chest. The way the girl's fingers lingered over textured fabrics, the way she smiled when sunlight warmed her cheek, the way she leaned into sounds and scents like they were lifelines. Elizabeth wasn't lost. She was listening in a language no one else was speaking. And so here they were, in the center of a room that felt more like a museum than a home, surrounded by leather furniture no one sat on and artwork no one looked at. Bridget dipped a wide brush into the warm yellow and guided Elizabeth's small hand to the palette. "Feel that?" Bridget asked softly. "That's the sun, warm, a little scratchy, like sand on a beach." Elizabeth's fingers explored the texture slowly, cautiously, and then, unexpectedly, a smile flickered across her face. Her hand moved toward the canvas. Bridget guided it gently, letting Elizabeth lead, letting her press the brush wherever instinct took her. "Higher," Elizabeth whispered, her voice tentative but clear. "The sun should be higher." Bridget's breath caught, but she didn't let it show. She adjusted the brush, Elizabeth's hand still in hers, and together they painted a bright arc across the top of the canvas. "Now the water," Bridget said, reaching for the smooth, cool blue. "This one's different. It's soft. It moves." Elizabeth giggled, a sound so unexpected it seemed to echo in the silent house. Her fingers danced over the blue, then swept it across the canvas in wavy strokes. "It splashes," she said, more confident now. "Put it next to the sun." Bridget obeyed, her heart pounding. This wasn't compliance. This was creation. Elizabeth was directing, imagining, seeing through touch and memory, and something deeper Bridget couldn't name. She didn't hear the front door open. She didn't hear Spencer Steve's polished shoes cross the marble foyer or the soft thud of his Italian leather briefcase hitting the floor. The house had long ago trained itself to move silently under his grief and control. But he heard them. More than that, he saw them. From the hallway, Spencer froze mid-step, his entire body going rigid. The woman he had hired to clean bathrooms and organize closets was kneeling in the middle of his living room with an easel and paints, murmuring instructions to his blind daughter as if she could see. And Elizabeth, his silent, withdrawn, unreachable Elizabeth, was laughing, pointing at the canvas with precision, describing colors and shapes she hadn't seen in 2 years. Spencer's throat tightened. Confusion hit first, then disbelief, then something that terrified him more than either. Hope. Before he could speak, before he could demand an explanation or reassert the control that had been slipping since the moment Bridget stepped into his home, Elizabeth turned her face toward his voice, sensing his presence before he announced it, and said something Spencer thought he'd never hear again. "Daddy." I can see it, not with her eyes, with something deeper, with her hands, her memory, her imagination set free. Spencer staggered back half a step, gripping the door frame to steady himself. His knees went soft, his vision blurred. Elizabeth's voice, her actual voice, so rarely used since the accident, hung in the air like a fragile thread between them, stronger than steel. Every therapist had said progress would be slow, measured, clinical. Every specialist had warned him not to expect breakthroughs, only incremental adjustments. He had listened. He had believed them. He had built his entire approach around managing expectations and maintaining control. But now his daughter had spoken. She hadn't just spoken. She had claimed something back, something Spencer thought was lost forever. Bridget lowered her brush slowly, her eyes wide, her expression unreadable. She looked at Spencer, waiting for his reaction, bracing for reprimand, possibly even dismissal. But Spencer couldn't speak, couldn't move. All he could do was stare at his daughter, whose face was full of something ancient and aching and bright, a recognition of memory disguised as color, disguised as joy. No one dared break the silence. Not even Bridget, who could sense that if a single unnecessary word entered the room now, it might fracture the moment beyond repair. Elizabeth looked between them, her father frozen in the doorway, Bridget still beside her, and blinked slowly as though waking from something long and dark. Spencer's eyes welled, but no tears fell. Instead, he looked down at the briefcase abandoned on the floor, then back at the painting, at Bridget, at Elizabeth. And suddenly, every wall he had spent 2 years building inside himself, grief disguised as efficiency, fear disguised as protection, trembled. Not all at once, but enough for a crack to form. A crack big enough to let in a thread of something dangerous, something essential, connection. Spencer had been terrified to feel it again, to even approach the edges of it. But here it was, blooming out of textured paint and whispered instructions in his daughter's laughter. He took a cautious step forward and knelt beside Elizabeth's chair, resting a tentative hand on her shoulder. Did you, did you paint that? He asked, his voice barely audible. Elizabeth nodded, her smile widening. Bridget helped me, but I chose where everything goes. The weight of that statement, I chose, carried more power than any business deal Spencer had ever closed, more meaning than any strategy he had ever designed. Bridget sat in stillness, waiting. She knew enough not to press, not to ruin what had just been born between father and daughter. Instead, she gently set the brush down and rested her hands in her lap. Elizabeth reached out slowly and touched the canvas, her fingers tracing the dried ridges of paint. Then she looked back toward Bridget, or where she sensed Bridget was, and whispered, "Can we do it again tomorrow?" Spencer sat back on his heels, stunned, undone. Nothing in his world of schedules and systems and certified professionals had prepared him for this. And yet, as the afternoon light shifted through the tall windows, it was clear something irreversible had happened. Not a miracle, just memory, just texture, just a girl, a woman, and a father standing on the edge of understanding. It shook open a door that had been locked for far too long. It let something in. And in that frozen moment where the air had become sacred, where nothing dared to creak or interrupt, the house that had felt like a museum finally remembered it was a home. The silence that lingered after Elizabeth's words didn't last long. By the next morning, the moment had been folded, compartmentalized, and Spencer had returned to the language he knew best: control. It began with a summons. Bridget stood outside Spencer's glass-walled office on the second floor, her hands steady at her sides despite the tightness in her chest. The room looked like it belonged in a corporate tower, not a family home. Sleek mahogany desk, minimalist shelves lined with awards, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking perfectly manicured grounds. Even the air felt calibrated, cool and still. Spencer sat behind the desk, fingers drumming a slow, deliberate rhythm. He didn't look up when she entered. He didn't greet her. The silence stretched like a warning. "What exactly were you doing with my daughter?" His voice was clipped, controlled, sharp enough to cut. Bridget met his gaze. "I was helping her express herself." "You were experimenting." Spencer leaned back, his jaw tight. Without my consent, without oversight, you were hired to clean, Bridget, not to play therapist. I wasn't playing, she said quietly. Elizabeth responded to texture and temperature. I gave her a way to communicate what she was feeling. Color as warmth, as memory. Memory? Spencer's tone hardened. She hasn't seen color in 2 years. What you saw yesterday was a fluke, a coincidence. Bridget shook her head gently. It wasn't just a game to her, Mr. Steve. She was leading. She knew where the sun should go. She directed every stroke. The room fell silent. Spencer's expression flickered. Confusion, then something deeper. Fear. If I let myself believe that, he said finally, his voice lower, almost vulnerable, and it doesn't last. If she regresses again, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Bridget softened. I understand, but keeping her safe from disappointment also keeps her trapped. Spencer exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. After a long pause, he straightened and reset his features into something harder, more familiar. Here are the conditions. No unsanctioned sessions, no more art therapy without my knowledge, and I want daily updates on Elizabeth's mood and behavior. Bridget listened, nodding once. Then she spoke, her voice steady. I'll agree to that, but I need one thing in return. Spencer's eyebrows lifted. You're negotiating? Be there sometimes, she said. Sit in the room. She needs to feel you choosing to stay, not watching from the hallway, not checking in between meetings, actually present. The request rattled him. Spencer was used to watching from behind glass, monitoring from a distance, controlling variables without entering the mess. But reluctantly, because some part of him knew she was right, he nodded. Fine, this afternoon I'll observe. That afternoon, Spencer stood awkwardly in the doorway of the living room, arms crossed, posture stiff. Bridget knelt beside Elizabeth, spreading textured palettes across the low table with the same quiet ritual as before. Remember the warm yellow? Bridget asked gently. Where does it belong today? Elizabeth's fingers explored the palette, sliding over rough ridges and smooth dips. Higher again, she whispered. The sun always goes up. Spencer watched as his daughter named colors by memory, blue like cool water, green like grass against bare feet, brown like warm earth. Her shoulders loosened. Her breathing slowed. She smiled. When the session ended, Elizabeth asked softly, Did Daddy see? Bridget glanced toward the doorway. He did. Elizabeth beamed. Later, alone in the living room, Spencer stood before the drying painting. It was clumsy, unrefined, chaotic, but it was alive. His daughter's hands had created something that hadn't existed an hour before. For the first time in months, Spencer allowed himself to consider a dangerous possibility. Maybe Elizabeth's world wasn't smaller than it used to be. Maybe it was just different. And maybe, just maybe, it was bigger than he had ever allowed. Over the next 2 weeks, Bridget and Elizabeth fell into a rhythm. What began as tentative art games evolved into structured sessions. Textured paints, scented markers, warm and cool stone tiles arranged on trays, sand mixed with lavender and rosemary that Elizabeth could shape and smell. Elizabeth's progress revealed itself in small but powerful moments. One afternoon, she asked for the stormy feeling on the canvas. Bridget guided her hand to a thick, rough gray. Elizabeth dragged the brush in sharp, angry strokes across the page, then paused and whispered, Now the calm one. Bridget offered smooth, cool blue. Elizabeth's strokes gentled, circling softly at the canvas's edge. Another day, Elizabeth mapped color to memory with startling clarity. The prickly one, she said, fingers hovering over a jagged, red texture, is when Daddy's on the phone and his voice gets hard. Bridget's chest tightened, but she kept her voice soft. And this one? She placed Elizabeth's hand on a velvety lavender square. That's when Nana used to sing. Elizabeth smiled faintly, before she got too sick. Bridget kept a discreet notebook tucked in her apron pocket, recording Elizabeth's reactions, colors she favored, phrases that hinted at visual memories she shouldn't still carry. One quiet session, while Elizabeth worked on a canvas depicting the night everything changed, fragments began to surface. There were bright lights, Elizabeth murmured, her fingers pressing hard into a sharp yellow. Too bright, and screeching, like metal screaming. Bridget stilled. Do you remember anything else? Elizabeth nodded slowly. Mommy's perfume, the flowery one, and something burning. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Daddy was shouting at someone to just keep driving. He sounded scared. Bridget's pulse quickened. The staff had gossiped about the accident in the kitchen one morning. A tragic collision, another driver at fault, Elizabeth's mother killed instantly, but nothing about Spencer being in the car, nothing about him shouting. A seed of suspicion took root. In the staff wing that evening, Mrs. Klein, the senior housekeeper, watched Bridget with narrowed eyes as she washed paint from her hands in the utility sink. Mr. Steve's been asking for you by name now, Mrs. Klein said. Her tone clipped. Funny how the new girl gets special treatment. Bridget dried her hands carefully. I'm just helping Elizabeth. That's not your job. Mrs. Klein's mouth pressed into a thin line. You're a maid, not a miracle worker. Don't forget that. Bridget held her gaze but said nothing. Some battles weren't worth fighting yet. Later that evening, Spencer passed the open door of the living room and froze. Elizabeth's voice drifted into the hallway, bright with excitement. Put the blue lake right there, Bridget, in the middle where it's coolest. Spencer's breath caught. Elizabeth hadn't seen blue since she was 8. She shouldn't remember it this vividly. She shouldn't be able to direct its placement with such confidence. That night, alone in his study, Spencer opened his laptop and typed Bridget's name into the search bar. The results loaded slowly. Bridget Fay, former sensory specialist at the Harmon Visual Therapy Center for Blind Children. An article from 3 years ago mentioned her resignation following a dispute with the director over experimental methods deemed too risky for vulnerable populations. Spencer sat back, his jaw tight. She clearly knew what she was doing. Her techniques weren't random. They were practiced, refined, deliberate. But why hadn't she told him? He stared at the glowing screen, torn between admiration for the results he'd witnessed and distrust over the secrets she'd kept. The cursor blinked in the search bar, waiting. Spencer closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair, Elizabeth's laughter still echoing in his mind. Spencer found Bridget in the kitchen the next morning, wiping paint from her hands at the sink. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. I found the article, he said quietly. The Harmon Center. Your resignation. Bridget's hands stilled. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze. I wondered when you would. Why didn't you tell me? She dried her hands carefully, choosing her words. Because I knew how it would sound. Experimental methods. Too risky. The director wanted sterile, one-size-fits-all protocols, liability over connection. Her voice softened. I believed, still believe, that children need art, mess, and risk to grow, not just safety. Spencer studied her face, searching for deception and finding only conviction. He should have been angry. Instead, he felt conflicted. Everything in him valued certifications, oversight, protocols. But he couldn't ignore what he'd witnessed. Elizabeth's laughter, her confidence, her voice. I don't know if I can trust this, he admitted. I don't know if I can ask you to, Bridget replied softly. In the staff wing, Mrs. Klein leaned toward the sous chef, her voice low but sharp. She's manipulating him, acting like she owns the child. Mark my words, this won't end well. The cook nodded, glancing nervously toward the hallway. Mr. Steve's different since she arrived. Distracted. Exactly, Mrs. Klein hissed. That afternoon, Spencer invited Dr. Reeves, Elizabeth's longtime clinical therapist, to observe one of Bridget's sessions. The woman arrived with a clipboard and a skeptical expression. Bridget guided Elizabeth through a new exercise. Warm and cool stone tiles arranged in patterns, scented markers for tracing shapes, textured fabrics layered on a board. Elizabeth's fingers moved with purpose, her face bright with concentration. The rough one goes here, Elizabeth sighed, placing a jagged piece of sandpaper. It's angry. The soft one next to it is the sorry part. Director Reeves leaned forward, her pen frozen above the page. In 30 minutes, Elizabeth had been more engaged, more articulate than she'd been in months of traditional therapy. Afterward, in the hallway, Dr. Reeves spoke carefully. She's responding well. But Bridget isn't licensed. There are boundaries, liability concerns. If something goes wrong, I understand, Spencer said tightly. Do you? Dr. Reeves pressed. Because right now, you're putting a lot of faith in someone who doesn't have credentials to back it up. On the drive to his office, Spencer gripped the steering wheel, Dr. Reeves's words echoing in his mind. But louder still was Elizabeth's laughter, her bright voice naming emotions and colors and memories. He didn't know which voice to trust. Meanwhile, Bridget began transforming a corner of the living room into a permanent sensory space. Baskets of textured objects, smooth stones, rough bark, silk scarves, a low shelf for paints and clay. A board with raised shapes Elizabeth could trace with her fingers. Staff whispered as they passed. She's turning the mansion into a daycare, one muttered. Who does she think she is? That evening, Spencer stood alone in the darkened living room, running his fingers over the rough edge of one of Elizabeth's canvases. The paint was dry now, the colors chaotic but alive. For the first time, he allowed himself to ask a dangerous question. What if following the rules, the certifications, the protocols, the careful boundaries had actually kept his daughter trapped? The canvas felt like an answer he wasn't ready to accept. The storm arrived at dusk, rolling over the Connecticut hills with the slow inevitability of something long anticipated. Thunder rattled the tall windows. Rain lashed against glass. Lightning flickered through the mansion's darkened hallways like fractured memory. Elizabeth sat rigid in the living room, her hands clutching the armrests of her chair, her breathing shallow and fast. Storms had terrified her since the accident, the sounds too close to screeching metal, the pressure in the air too reminiscent of that night. Bridget knelt beside her, voice soft and steady. Elizabeth, we can paint the storm out, turn the fear into something we can touch. Elizabeth's fingers trembled. I don't want to. I know, Bridget said gently, but sometimes the only way through is to name it. She dimmed the lights, guided Elizabeth to the window, and let her feel the cool glass vibrating under raindrops. Then she led her back to the easel, hands never leaving Elizabeth's shoulders. What does the storm feel like? Bridget asked, arranging the textured paints. Elizabeth's voice was barely a whisper. Sharp, hot, too bright. Bridget placed Elizabeth's hand on a thick, rough orange. Then start there. Elizabeth hesitated, then dragged the brush across the canvas in a violent smear near the bottom. That's the light, she murmured. The one that hurt my eyes. Bridget's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice calm. Where else? Elizabeth's hand moved with growing certainty, guided by memory rather than sight. A jagged black line for the guardrail, a dark, heavy patch for the car that came from nowhere. Her breathing steadied as the scene took shape. Then the words began to spill out, fragments she had never spoken aloud. Mommy was shouting Daddy's name. She kept saying, Spencer, please. But he was on the phone. His voice was angry. Elizabeth's fingers pressed harder into the canvas. The driver didn't stop. Mommy begged him to slow down, but he just kept going. Bridget's chest tightened. This wasn't imagination. This was memory, precise and specific, bubbling up through texture and color. She felt torn, encourage Elizabeth to keep releasing the trauma, or pull her back before the memory consumed her. But Elizabeth was already finishing, her hands shaking as she added one final stroke. After this part, she whispered. Everything went black. The storm outside cracked with thunder. Elizabeth flinched, and Bridget immediately pulled her close, wrapping her in a soft blanket and guiding her hands to smooth, cool fabric. You're here now, Bridget murmured, grounding her with firm, calming touch. You're safe, the storm is outside. You're inside with me. Elizabeth's breathing slowed. Her body relaxed. She leaned into Bridget's shoulder and didn't speak again. Later, alone in her small staff room, Bridget sat cross-legged on the narrow bed, staring at the painting she'd carried upstairs. The layout of the road, the angle of the light, and there, half hidden in the dark patch Elizabeth had insisted she felt, a shape that looked disturbingly like a logo, angular and distinct. None of this matched the story the staff had whispered. Not the version where another driver caused the crash. Not the version where Spencer wasn't even in the car. Spencer needed to know. But how could she tell him without sounding like she'd manipulated his traumatized daughter into painting false memories? Outside, the storm raged on, lightning splitting the sky. Inside, Bridget felt another storm forming, one that would tear through the fragile trust she and Spencer had built. She set the painting against the wall and closed her eyes, knowing that tomorrow everything would change again. Mrs. Klein made her move on a Tuesday morning while Spencer was in his office reviewing quarterly reports. She sat in her small staff room, phone pressed to her ear, voice measured and concerned as she spoke to Spencer's corporate HR department. I'm calling about a liability issue. The new maid, Bridget Fay, has been performing unauthorized therapy on Mr. Steve's daughter. She's unlicensed. If something goes wrong, the family could be exposed to lawsuits. The HR director's tone shifted immediately. Therapy? She was hired for housekeeping. Exactly, Mrs. Klein said, satisfaction seeping into her voice. But she's been conducting daily sessions. Experimental methods. The child is vulnerable. I thought you should know. 20 minutes later, Spencer's phone rang. The HR director didn't waste time. Spencer, we have a situation. An unlicensed staff member performing experimental treatment on Elizabeth. NDAs, insurance, reputation. This is a massive liability. If anything happens, the company and your family are exposed. Spencer's jaw tightened. What are you talking about? Bridget Fay. She's been conducting therapy sessions without credentials. We need to suspend her immediately pending an internal review. Spencer ended the call and sat in silence. Fury building, at the accusation, at Mrs. Klein's betrayal, at himself for not anticipating this. He found Bridget in the living room, cleaning paintbrushes. His voice came out harder than he intended. Why didn't you tell me the full extent of your background? The intensity of what you've been doing? Bridget looked up, confusion flickering across her face. I thought you knew. I didn't know you were conducting trauma therapy, Spencer snapped. Elizabeth's painting from the storm. What did you do? Plant those images? What? No. Bridget set the brushes down, her voice rising. She remembered them herself. The accident. The details that don't match the official story. That sounds like wild speculation, Spencer interrupted. Or manipulation. I don't know which is worse. Bridget's face paled. Spencer, please. I have to protect Elizabeth. The words tasted cold, corporate. You're suspended until we complete an internal review. Bridget stepped back as if struck. You're firing me? Suspending, Spencer corrected, though the distinction felt hollow. An hour later, Bridget stood in the small guest room where staff kept their belongings, packing a suitcase with trembling hands. Elizabeth's laughter echoed somewhere in the house, unaware. When Bridget descended the stairs, Elizabeth was in the hallway. The girl turned toward the sound of footsteps, her face brightening. Bridget? Bridget knelt, voice thick. I have to take some time off. Sweetheart. Elizabeth reached for her, confusion twisting her features. Why, did I do something wrong? No, Bridget whispered. Never. A staff member gently guided Elizabeth away. Come on, honey, Bridget will be back soon. But Elizabeth knew lies when she heard them. Over the next 3 days, Elizabeth regressed. She refused to touch paint. She withdrew into silence, barely eating, moving through the house like a ghost. At night, she woke screaming from nightmares no one could soothe. Dr. Reeves returned, but Elizabeth wouldn't respond. The clinical therapist sat across from the girl, speaking gently, offering exercises. Elizabeth turned her face away. Spencer watched from the doorway, helpless. His daughter's light was flickering out again, dimming with each passing hour. On the 4th morning, he stood in Elizabeth's room, watching her sit motionless in her chair, and the truth struck him like a physical blow. In trying to avoid risk, he had taken away the one person who had helped Elizabeth feel alive. The protection he thought he was offering was just another cage, and Elizabeth was dying inside it. The conference room felt like a courtroom. Spencer sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by his foundation's advisory board, HR representatives, and Dr. Reeves. Bridget arrived last, composed but pale, exhaustion carved into the hollows beneath her eyes. She took the empty chair across from Spencer and folded her hands in her lap. The HR director opened with formalities, then cut to the core. Ms. Fay, you lack proper licensing. You have a history of disputes at your previous therapy center. If this situation had become public, the PR fallout alone could have been devastating. Bridget met his gaze steadily. I understand your concerns. Then why did you proceed? One board member asked sharply. Bridget pulled a small notebook from her bag and opened it carefully. Because Elizabeth responded, she engaged with textures, temperatures, emotional memory. I documented every session, her reactions, her progress, the colors she favored. She slid the notebook across the table. I never acted recklessly. I acted as someone who cared. Dr. Reeves shifted uncomfortably. For the record, she said quietly, Elizabeth has regressed significantly since Ms. Fay's suspension. She won't engage with traditional therapy. The art sessions produced unprecedented breakthroughs, more than I've seen in 2 years. Silence settled over the room. Spencer had intended to remain neutral, to let the process unfold without emotion. But watching Bridget sit alone, defending her care for his daughter while a room full of professionals debated liability and paperwork, something inside him fractured. He stood abruptly, walked to the corner where he'd stacked Elizabeth's paintings, and carried them to the table. One by one he laid them out, early formless blobs, then increasingly vivid scenes, then finally the storm painting with its jagged lines and half-hidden details. Look at these, Spencer said, his voice rough. This is my daughter's voice. This is her trying to communicate what she couldn't say out loud. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. If you strip away the titles and fear of blame, who helped Elizabeth find this? Who made her laugh for the first time in months? The room remained still. Then the door burst open. A staff member rushed in, Elizabeth in her arms. The girl clutched one of her paintings, her face streaked with tears. I'm sorry, Mr. Steve, the staff member stammered. She insisted. Elizabeth reached forward blindly, her small voice breaking. Bridget, are you here? Bridget rose instinctively. I'm here, sweetheart. Elizabeth lunged toward her voice, trembling as Bridget caught her. The girl pressed the painting into Bridget's hands and repeated, her voice desperate. She helps me see. Don't take her away. Please don't take her away. The room fell silent. Several board members looked away, visibly moved. After a long moment, the foundation's chair cleared her throat. We'll take a brief recess to deliberate. 15 minutes later, they returned with their decision. Bridget would be reinstated, but formalized as a sensory arts specialist under the foundation's umbrella, with oversight, professional support, and proper documentation. No more secrets, no more suspicion. Bridget nodded, relief flooding her features. Afterward, in the quiet hallway, Bridget touched Spencer's arm. Thank you. He shook his head. I should have trusted you from the start. Bridget's expression sobered. Spencer, there's something you need to know. Elizabeth's memories about that night, they're not finished, and they don't match what people have been telling her. Spencer's chest tightened. What do you mean? The storm painting, Bridget said softly. The details she remembers. You need to see it again. Really see it. Spencer nodded slowly, dread settling in his stomach. The truth Elizabeth had painted was waiting, and he wasn't sure he was ready to face it. The Community Arts Center gleamed with possibility. Spencer had funded the entire renovation, tactile walls with raised patterns, low soothing lights that shifted in warmth rather than brightness, raised captions beside each piece. The space hummed with quiet energy as blind children moved through the gallery, their fingers exploring Elizabeth's paintings with wonder. It was both PR and penance, a way to channel the controversy into something meaningful, to prove Bridget's methods had value beyond one family's walls. Elizabeth stood beside Bridget near the main display, her shoulders straight, her chin lifted. Other children touched her work and laughed, describing what they felt. This one's angry. This one's like sunshine. Spencer watched from the edge of the room, his chest tight with pride and dread. Midway through the event, Bridget knelt beside Elizabeth and spoke softly. Do you want to finish the story? The one you started in the storm painting? Only if you are ready. Elizabeth hesitated, then nodded. I'm ready. Bridget guided her to a fresh canvas set up for a live demonstration. A small crowd gathered. Parents, educators, foundation board members. Spencer moved closer, his pulse quickening. Elizabeth's fingers found the textured paints. Guided by memory, she added details with startling precision. A distinctive emblem on the front of a car, angular and sharp. The sound of Spencer's voice, she explained, arguing on speakerphone. A scent she remembered. The cologne worn by their driver, Marcus. The man Spencer had trusted completely. The car was going too fast, Elizabeth murmured, her hand steady. Mommy kept saying, Marcus, slow down. But he didn't listen. He said Daddy needed him to make the meeting on time. Spencer's breath caught. The painting showed their car, not the other vehicle, slightly over the line, headlights blinding, Marcus ignoring Grace's warnings. Elizabeth turned her face toward where she sensed her father standing. Mommy was scared before it happened. She squeezed my hand so tight. The crowd stilled. Spencer felt the room spin. Marcus had claimed another driver caused the crash. He'd testified, collected insurance, even received a settlement on Spencer's behalf. But Elizabeth's memory told a different story, one where Spencer's obsession with punctuality, his relentless pressure on his staff, had indirectly killed his wife and stolen his daughter's sight. Overwhelmed, Spencer turned and pushed through the crowd. Stumbling into the hallway outside, he braced himself against the wall, his vision blurring with tears. Bridget followed moments later. Spencer, it's my fault, he choked out. I pushed Marcus to drive like that. Grace died because I couldn't miss a meeting. Bridget touched his arm gently. Elizabeth isn't painting to accuse you. She's painting to release what's been trapped inside her. She needs you to hear it, not carry it alone. Spencer wiped his face roughly. What do I do? You tell her the truth, Bridget said softly, that you made mistakes, that you're here now. Spencer returned to the gallery. He knelt beside Elizabeth, his voice raw. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I should have protected you and Mommy better. I won't hide from that anymore. Elizabeth reached for his face, her fingers tracing his tears. You're here now, Daddy. That's what matters. Spencer pulled her close, holding her as if she might disappear. Later, he announced plans to reopen the investigation, to offer restitution to Grace's family, to ensure Marcus faced consequences if the truth supported Elizabeth's memory. The exhibition ended not with grand applause, but with quiet, heartfelt recognition. Not for tragedy, but for the courage it took to face it. The mansion felt different now. The once sterile living room had been transformed. Baskets of textured objects lined low shelves. A permanent sensory art corner occupied the space where a decorative table once stood untouched. And laughter echoed through halls that had known only polished quiet for years. Spencer had stepped back from the relentless CEO grind, delegating more responsibility while pouring energy and resources into the new sensory arts program under the Steve Foundation. Bridget served as his lead consultant, splitting her time between the growing center and the mansion. But every day she returned for Elizabeth's personal sessions. Their bond was quiet, deep, and unquestioned. This afternoon, Elizabeth worked on her first true portrait, 3 raised silhouettes created with thick textured paint. A tall figure, a smaller child, another adult with her hand resting over the child's. Spencer entered the living room and paused, watching them. Bridget sat beside Elizabeth, guiding without directing, present without hovering. Can I see? Spencer asked softly. Elizabeth smiled. Come touch it, Daddy. Spencer knelt and ran his fingers over the drying paint, feeling the raised shapes beneath his hands. Who are they? Elizabeth's voice was certain. You, me, Bridget. Spencer's throat tightened. She hadn't painted just a family. She'd painted a chosen family, one built on trust, art, and honesty rather than blood alone. He looked at Bridget, who met his gaze with quiet understanding. I want to make your role official, Spencer said. Expanded, permanent, not just for Elizabeth, but for all the children who need what you offer. Bridget nodded, emotion flickering across her face. I'd be honored. Spencer's voice dropped, raw and unguarded. You taught me how to see her. I had all this money, all these resources, and I still didn't know how. You know now, Bridget said softly. That's what matters. As the afternoon light shifted, Elizabeth asked, Bridget, what does the sunset look like today? Bridget stood and extended her hand. Let's go find out. They walked to the patio together, Spencer following. Bridget guided Elizabeth's hands to the warm stone railing, let her feel the gentle breeze, positioned her face toward the fading heat of the sun. The sky is layering, Bridget said quietly, warm orange near the horizon, like the rough paint you love, then soft pink, smooth and gentle, and at the bow, cool purple, fading into blue. Elizabeth closed her eyes, her fingers tracing patterns on the stone. I can feel the warmth changing. The colors are moving. Spencer stood on her other side, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. Together, they painted the sky with words, touch, and shared presence. Spencer's mind drifted back to that first afternoon, walking into his living room and seeing his maid kneeling beside his blind daughter with paints and an easel, thinking it was chaos, thinking it was reckless. Now he understood. That was the moment everything began. Elizabeth reached out, her paint-stained hand finding both of theirs. She smiled, her face tilted toward the warmth she couldn't see, but somehow knew Mao completely. I can see it, she whispered. This time, Spencer didn't doubt it at all. If this story moved you, share the moment. Don't let it fade. Follow Motherland Stories and tap that like button to keep these voices alive. Every day, we uncover strong stories, raw truths, and quiet acts of courage that shape our world. Join a circle of listeners, dreamers, and changemakers, because every story deserves to be heard. This wasn't just an episode, it was a call to remember. Silence hides injustice. Courage exposes it. At Motherland Stories, we don't turn away. We bear witness. Subscribe and stand with stories that challenge power and celebrate truth.